Master Jesse Cohen from Summit School of Chess here today with another quick tidbit video for you. Today is our talk on essential king and pawn versus king endgames. We have to understand how chess works on a very basic level so that we can use those basic building blocks and apply them to larger positions. In this video, there's basically two things you need to know about, okay? The first thing you need to know about is critical squares. Every single pawn, except for rook pawns, which we're not going to really get into too much today, have three critical squares. And this is just for king and pawn versus king. The three critical squares for a pawn on e2 are d4, e4, and f4. What do these three critical squares matter to you? The answer is that if you can get your king on any of those squares, you have a guaranteed win. It doesn't matter if you're against Magnus Carlsen or Nakamura or anyone. You have a guaranteed win, okay? If your king can get to one of those squares. So if you could just calculate, hey, can I get to the critical square in time? You know for a fact, that you are going to win. The other thing that you have to know in this course to understand this is this term called opposition, okay? I'm not going to go over it too in depth in this one, but here's basically what opposition is. Opposition is when the kings get squared off like this, and there is an odd number of squares in between the kings, in this case, 1. I know that this doesn't seem like it matters, but there are going to be times where the kings square off against each other, and what's happening here is they are fighting for critical squares. Typically, if I'm saying black as the defender is taking the opposition, what I'm really saying is that black has achieved the opposition stance and is making it so that white cannot win. He is keeping white out of those critical squares. Whereas if I say that white, the side that is actually winning here with the extra pawn, if I say that they're taking the opposition, then they're also fighting for those critical squares. In this case, fighting for dominance over them, because we need to secure them more and more as we go up the board in order to win this game, okay? So let's go back to our starting position. In this position, the quick thing I need to ask myself is this a win? Can my king get to one of these three critical squares before the black king can stop me? Take a time out really quick, pause the video if you've got to, and see if you can find out, can white occupy one of those three critical squares, d4, e4, or f4, before black can prevent it? Also buys me some time to take a drink. The answer is no. Black cannot prevent it. White will succeed. For example, king f2, king e7, king e3, king e6, king e4, or king d4 or king f4. It doesn't matter. White will get to one of those three critical squares. Now let's see it in action. Boop, bloop, boop, dit, doop. And actually, white has taken the opposition here, which doesn't matter too much, but will a little bit, as we'll see. Okay, now, something else you have to remember with this is that while we are on the three critical squares right now, we do need to be thinking about how we're going to get to future critical squares. And we have to be thinking about this all the way until we get to the 6th rank. Because repeat after me, folks. Remember this, burn it into your heads, whatever. A king on the 6th and a pawn on the 5th always wins the game. If you have a king on the 6th, if I can get my king to d6, e6, or f6, and that pawn up to e5, it is a guaranteed win. I mean, it was a guaranteed win as well with the critical squares, but at that point, it's just like, you really can't mess up too much, as long as you just take your time and see it through. Okay, so basically, here's what I'm saying. Black's got to make a move, right? What should I play here? A lot of players might make a mistake here and play pawn e3. This would be a huge mistake. Why? Opposition. Black takes the opposition, fighting white back again for those three critical squares. And white can dance back and forth all day now because black takes the opposition. Black's the one to make that squaring off. And if white ever pushes that pawn, then the new critical squares are going to be here. and black has domination over those squares. That is a quick way to know that it is just going to be a draw. So what should white have done instead? Instead, white should take the next set of critical squares. When that pawn goes to e3, the next set will be d5, e5, and f5. We have an opportunity to take f5. Let's do it. If black is going to try and charge at our pawn right now, we are not afraid. King d5, e4 check, king to d6, king to f6. And you'll notice we've already got on the next set of critical squares, e5 is forced, we have a king on the 6th and the pawn on the 5th, we're always going to win this game, okay? Black's best defense here actually is to go back and try and guard the next set of critical squares. Big question, pause your video time in just a second. Should white catch up this pawn and play pawn to e4 right now? Should white play pawn to e4 right now? And remember, while you're thinking about this question, remember, the bigger question is, after white plays e4, what is black's best move? What are the critical squares I will have to get into after that pawn goes there? And most importantly, can I actually get there? Okay? So when I play that pawn to e4, the new critical squares are going to be d6, e6, and f6. After black plays king f7, can I get there? And unfortunately, the answer is no. Pawn e4, king f7, opposition, fighting me for those critical squares. And we can go back and forth all day long, and black will not concede those 3 critical squares. And if I ever push, again, now the critical squares are up here, and again, it's just going to be a draw, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. What white should have done again in this position is one of 2 things. Oops. Either play pawn to e3, because you know you're already on one of the critical squares, so it doesn't matter what black plays, you know you're still winning. Or you can take the opposition one more time and fight black for those 3 critical squares that we ultimately need to get. Because again, once you get that king to the whole 6th rank, you don't have to worry about opposition anymore. That's why it's such a big deal. In this case, black has to choose one of these squares. It doesn't matter. We take over the final set of critical squares, and now it's easy. Now we can push that pawn up there nice and neat, and we finally have a king on the 6th and a pawn on the 5th, so we are always going to win this game. Now there is one last thing to calculate. You should be feeling so good right now. You've come this far in the video. You have got a winning position. If you were playing me, Magnus Carlsen, whoever, you could beat us right now, easy, hands down. Okay? You just have one last thing to calculate. Should you push the pawn, or should you take the opposition with king e4, or king e6, my bad? Pause your video again if you're watching this on YouTube, or take a second and ask yourself which is which. And remember, in the endgames, we cannot afford to guess. Either white is successful in making this queen, or we're not. We can't just do what looks good. We have to see it all the way through. One of these 2 moves is going to assure that white succeeds in making that pawn to a queen, and one of them is going to fail, actually. Can you see which one is which? I bet you can. And even if you had a hard time, thank you for trying. If you keep trying, you're going to get there, okay? The wrong move here is to push the pawn. If we push the pawn, they play here, king d8, one last opposition, and here's how you know your king and pawn endgame went bad. If you push that pawn to the row before it becomes a queen, and it is check, and that's all there is on the board, just this king and pawn and king, this is bad news. That king hides in front of that pawn, and it is a draw. Not yet, but do you see why it's very much about to be a draw in one move? Here's white's options. La, 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 which all give away that pawn for free, which is definitely a draw, or this move. And why is this move a draw? Stalemate. Remember, if it's your turn to move, and you're not in check, and you can't move, again, it's against the rules to put the king anywhere here, the white king would take it, it's called stalemate, and it's a draw. So, nope. We need to take that opposition one last time, fighting black for that next set of squares for us to control. Whichever way they go, they give up one of those squares. We take control, and now the king is the best escort in the whole wide world. There is nothing black can do against the push queen, and there you have it. Okay? 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 You might think this is boring, but I'm telling you, if you play soccer or world football or any sport, there are things called drills. things you just have to know that you do over and over and over again, and you just kind of get that muscle reflex response. Okay? If you want to get better at chess, you got to start doing these drills and doing these fundamental techniques. Okay? The last thing I'm going to show you is this. How do you draw these positions? I'm going to make an extreme example. Here's my extreme example. In this position, white's still going up, and the critical squares are right here. But black has firmly taken over control of all of that. Okay? In this case, you're just going to have to watch the pattern. All black is going to do this entire time is go up and down, up and down, up and down. And if white ever pops the king forward around the side of the pawn to try and help, we are going to square off with opposition and square off with that king each time. That's it. Up and down, up and down. If he comes forward, we square off. That's it. That's all you gotta do. Watch. We go straight back. He comes up. Boom. We square off. Check. Boom. We stay in front of that pawn. Straight back. He tries to come up this way. Boom. Opposition. Check. We stay in front of the pawn. And we just repeat this over and over and over again. And what ends up happening is exactly the variation where we tried to push the pawn incorrectly a moment ago. Check. Again, you know it's a bad day when you're giving check with the pawn on the square before it should become a queen. Because then they're going to move in front of the pawn, and now you either lose the pawn or you stalemate them, and there goes the win. Okay? So again, what are the takeaways from this lesson? Number one, know the critical squares. I should be able to put a pawn anywhere on this board, and you should be able to be like, okay, no matter where these kings are, here's the pawn. You know, is this a win or not? And you'd be like, well, okay, the critical squares are here, here, and here. Who's going to have control of those first? And in this case, without even too much calculation, we can see that black is going to have control of those squares first. Black's going to get to those way before white does. It's going to take white 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is a draw. It just is a draw. And by knowing the critical squares, it's going to save you so much time. The other thing is opposition. Remember the true purpose of opposition. I say this again because I've had many students who will take opposition for random reasons during the endgame and be like, opposition! They always think it's a good thing. Just like beginners at first always think that giving check is a good thing. Is check always a good thing? No. It depends on how the opponent has to respond. If the opponent has bad ways, then it's a good check. Okay? Or if they only had bad ways. Okay? So, yeah, practice these things, and know the patterns, know the critical squares, know that the purpose of opposition is fighting for critical squares. It's all about those critical squares, and thank you again for tuning in. Please, if you're on Twitch, I appreciate the follows, I appreciate the subscribes. If you're on YouTube, I appreciate, the subscribe, the likes, the comments. Let me know what you want these videos to be about, and I will continue doing that for you. So until tomorrow, I say goodbye for now. Bye!